geographically, either to Lviv or something else, and to perhaps leave the capital. And so I think it's far from over, and I think it's rather questionable whether they can push all the way to the Polish border if that's the kind of maximalist goal they're actually going for.
Andrea, let me go to you. What do you make of the, I guess, debate now about whether Putin, the pragmatist, at least someone who has core beliefs but will weigh up the costs and benefits of some proposed action, has moved into someone who is unable to do this? And that is one of the explanations for the kind of lack of obvious logic to the military operation, given the political goals that they've set out for themselves. I mean, do you see, you've watched Putin for a long time, do you see a different actor here than we have seen in the past?
Putin, all the things that we know about Putin are still there, but I think they're kind of amplified and aggravated by COVID and other things. And I guess what I mean by that is we've always known, that he's a risk taker. I mean, you just look at, the brazenness, the poisoning of Navalny, putting poison in his underpants and all these things. So he's always been kind of a brazen actor. But I think, what's changed, and this is something that is true of a lot of other longtime authoritarian leaders, is that the longer that you are in office and when you are this highly personalized type of authoritarian regime, the more prone you are to making mistakes. And I really think that's kind of what is happening. I think this is still Putin, but after 22 years in power and after having a highly personalized political system, after being so isolated for 2 years with COVID, I think he is just flat out miscalculating. And Mike raised a really good point there about his inability to learn from what happened in 2014 and 2015 in Ukraine. If you think about then, when they went into 2015, Putin had this misguided belief then that they were going to unleash an outpouring of popular support for Russia in the east of the country, which clearly never came to fruition. And the fact that he is unable to kind of learn from his past mistakes, I think says a lot about kind of his mentality and type of leadership. And certainly now with this kind of hyper personalization that we see, to me, this really is about kind of miscalculation, making mistakes. And I think, people, is he unhinged? That's a question to me. It seems like he's just really doubling down on the strategy because of the risks that are involved. One thing we do know with personalized regimes too, is that they tend to exit power violently. One thing that helps explain the type of transition is what a leader can expect in their post-tenure fate, right? Democracies, you're a democratic leader, you retire peacefully and you have your, mansion somewhere and you kind of peacefully ride off into the sunset. Well, all of these stories, people say over and over, he watched the overthrow of Gaddafi and him being drugged through the streets. I think that's what he imagines for what could happen to him if he does leave power, particularly in a moment like this. And so he is going to dig in, double down. And that's something that I think we have to be very aware of as we're thinking about obviously trying to force opposition to confront Putin. But we also need to be really careful about unintended risks and escalation. So I think that's where he is. It's hard to say if he's unhinged. To me, it's a kind of embattled personalist dictator who's fearful of what happens next, recognizing that if this goes badly for him, he could be jailed, imprisoned, or killed. And so he's doubling down on a losing strategy. I liked Jeff's statement about throwing dumb at dumb, but that's kind of where we are.
So, Andrea, does that suggest that, at least as an official narrative, we should stay far away in the United States from these kind of regime change in Russia narratives that we're here at? I saw Senator Graham had a tweet about somebody just needs to take this guy out, and things like that. Could these things have the effect of cornering someone who already feels paranoid and like this is the kind of situation in which he would be personally vulnerable, that he's sort of worried about for a long time, with protests on the streets, the world imposing sanctions and cutting Russia off from everything, maybe the military operation not going according to plan. And now, here come the Americans and they're sort of talking about regime change in Russia. Or is it the kind of thing where, we should be talking about those things because this is the moment when, at great potential personal peril, we see people taking to the streets in Russia. They don't like what's happening in Ukraine or in Russia itself.
So I understand the sentiment of regime change, particularly in this moment in time. It is definitely clear that I don't see a good way through this while Putin is still there. And I think that's kind of where everyone is. I think that helps explain why we've seen the Europeans shift so dramatically in what they've been willing to do in order to confront Putin. I think that is a widely held sentiment at this point. But I think we have to be very careful about having an explicit policy of regime change. I think we need to be a lot more careful and calibrated and calculated with the kind of public rhetoric because of the risks. I mean, it's just as you say, I do worry, we know that the number one thing that Putin cares about is the persistence of the regime. And that's goal number one. And if he does feel that his regime, and more personally, his personal safety is at risk, then I think we are going to, you really run the risk that he will double down and do things that are relatively extreme in order to preclude that outcome. You just, think about what, Assad has been willing to do in Syria and other things when these leaders feel cornered, embattled, when regime change is at stake. And when I think that they rightly calculate, that their very lives are at risk. They control the instruments of power, and they're therefore willing to use them in order to protect themselves. And so I definitely understand the sentiment of regime change. We do see Russians going to great risk, personal risk, to speak out with a war and with a leader who they disagree with. But we have to be, I think, just careful and calculated and calibrated in the way that we continue to approach Putin so that we can offer a way out of this. It is useful that Macron is still talking to Putin. I think that the only way out of this is through diplomacy. I don't think it's going to be settled on the battlefield. So it's either at the diplomatic table or it's with some sort of post-Putin future. And I think we want to be pushing towards the diplomatic off-ramps to the extent that we can because of the really significant risks that would be accompanied, I think, with a regime change route and kind of adopting that as an official policy or discourse.
Yeah, in a few minutes, I want to talk specifically about off-ramps and how this may or may not end. Jeff, let me go to you. I saw you nodding when Andrea was talking, so maybe you have something to add on that. And also maybe you can address the nuclear alerting. My understanding is that the rhetoric and the decision to put Russian forces, to increase the alert level of Russian nuclear forces has not been accompanied by anything moving or anything that we've seen.
Right, that's my understanding. And the original alert was actually for their deterrent forces, which include conventional and nuclear. So and even some Russian colleagues I've talked to don't really understand what that means in a technical sense. I do think, if this conflict, and I said this before, if this conflict expands to, encompass a NATO-Russia war, then obviously we really have to worry about that. But Putin's pretty fast to reference nuclear weapons as a reminder of the dangers of tangling with Russia, and on him, I would just agree. Something sticks with me, and I've used it a couple of times since then, that Andrea said during the last episode, and that's these regimes seem somewhat stable until suddenly they aren't. And we're not going to, if this happens, it's going to happen organically. I don't think calls for regime change out from us is actually very helpful at all. And I think if this happens, it's going to happen organically, and it's not something we're going to see coming. I don't think. Because it's not going to be something that he's going to necessarily see coming. And so I think we just have to be cautious on that part. I will say, a month ago, if you had asked me if there was a chance Putin was going to exit in a year or so, or sometime in the relatively near future, I would have said highly likely not. And I'm reevaluating that the longer this goes on.
So let's say that there is an exit. This is just speculation, but what could that look like? Are we talking about a popular, unsustainable protest on the streets of Moscow indefinitely, and Putin realizes this is not going to work anymore? Or, is this a Khrushchev kind of thing where, suddenly the leader, the folks around the leader decide they've got to replace this guy? What are the possible avenues for this? Do we have any sense?
I don't know that there is one for him, because my understanding, if he's looking out the window and he's, there's mass hysteria, or he feels he's losing control of the state because of the state of the economy and run on banks or what have you, he doesn't look at that and say, this is a policy failure on my part, I need to exit because what I tried to do didn't work.
Right.
It's just, this is the culmination of the actions the West has taken to get rid of me. And so I need to escalate, or I need to do something. But I just don't think, I mean, he's a master of killing roadmaps. So I mean, off ramps. And so, you know, I don't see a situation where he's like, okay, it didn't work. I'm not popular anymore. I'm going to exit. I don't think that's a viable scenario.
Can I jump in, Richard? So, I mean, I think it's not like an either or. I don't think it's going to be an elite-led thing or a popular-driven thing. I think when you have like a long time kind of established authoritarian regime like Putin's, it has to be both. And so this fact that you're seeing some sort of signs of elites speaking out, the Lukoil announcement yesterday speaking out against the war was really interesting. Deripaska selling the Chelsea Football Club and donating the proceeds to the victims of the war in Ukraine. I mean, these kinds of public displays of elite disagreement seem different to me after watching for a very long time, different than what you even saw in 2011 and 2012, where there were large-scale protests. So, but there's a like symbiotic relationship, I think, between what's happening at the elite level and what's happening at the public level. So the elite statements, I think, also, to the extent that Russians are aware of them, can help create a more permissive environment for protests. Again, it comes back to those informative signals. I don't think that the elite will move on Putin absent of a lot of people in the streets. And that is also, you know, I've looked at how longtime authoritarian leaders like Putin leave. When you've been in power after 20 years in power, that the likelihood of being ousted by the elite making a move against a leader absent mass mobilization is extremely small. It was 10% of all leaders who were like Putin exited that way. Protest was a lot higher. And so I think so the elite are likely to be kind of right. They'll be the ones who actually have to knock Putin off, because as Jeff said, he's not going to see people out on the streets and kind of shrink away and say, gosh, I'm not popular, I better call it a day. It's going to be about either he'll make the call to tell his security services to fire on protesters and they won't do it. Or there'll be some sort of, in the face of mass mobilization, I think the elite then move to remove him from office. But I think within a regime like Putin's, I don't think it's going to be one or the other. I think it's going to have to be kind of a confluence of both.
Andrea, do you think that looking at Russian history, it tells us anything about the likelihood or lack thereof of this? I'm just thinking that, you know, so it was the attempted internal coup against Khrushchev, which didn't work. Then there was the one that worked. That's the only one I can think of that ever did, at least in the past 100 years. I mean, Stalin probably wasn't poisoned and, you know, and died a natural death. You know, or is that in any way relevant to what we're seeing now? Or are we just in terra incognita?
I mean, we're in such a different place now, given like, you know, this war. I mean, this really is just such a unprecedented kind of situation. I think in Russia is such an unprecedented situation. If you had asked me before the war, I would have said Putin most likely will die of natural causes in office. He'll stay in until he dies. And you look at the other leaders, Russian leaders who were the longest serving, they all died in office, Stalin, etc. So, I mean, and that is also borne out in the empirical record. When you look at these longtime authoritarian regimes, death in office is the most likely. So, I mean, we're talking about situations where Putin could be unseated. It is still plausible, although less likely, as Jeff said, you know, a week ago, that Putin will be able to ride this out and he will remain in office until he dies of natural causes. That is still, I think, maybe even the most likely scenario. But again, his hold on power is significantly weaker than it was a week ago. And then in my mind, if it's not death in office, if he's not able to write it out, then it's going to be some sort of, I think it will be accompanied by mass mobilization, because it's very hard for me to imagine the elite moving without that kind of motivation from the public. I mean, again, like think about the elite too. It's, you want to be, I think their finger is going to be in the wind. I mean, the one of the reasons Putin has managed to last so long is there's never been a viable alternative. There is no alternative center of gravity around which the elite can coalesce, much less the public. But I think right now people's are, you know, their finger is going to be in the wind trying to gauge the political breezes. And you want to always, if you're a member of the elite, want to be on the winning side. And that's why these things happen so quickly. Think about Tokayev in Kazakhstan. He pushed Nazarbayev out and everyone rallied behind him. You don't want to be the odd man out. That's a dangerous place to be. And so as Jeff said, I don't think we're going to see it coming. It's like it happens slowly until it happens really quickly. And I think that's, you know, what we're going to be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Let me go to a few questions from folks who are tuning in. So, and Mike, maybe I can put this one to you. Mark has a question about European countries talking about sending more weapons to Ukraine. Are there still ways of getting weapons into Ukraine? And are the Russians trying to prevent that?
Yeah, I mean, you can still get weapons into Ukraine via ground transport. There's a lot of western parts of Ukraine the Russian forces haven't entered and don't control. And that's the easiest way to get weapons into Ukraine. I don't see anybody flying into Ukraine necessarily. That's pretty unlikely at this point. But I think most of the weapons you need are fundamentally man-portable. Ukrainians need logistics, and you need more of those simpler capabilities. Some of the other ideas that are out there are a bit wild, like MiG-29s and fourth-generation aircraft. That's not going to do Ukraine a lot of good, to be perfectly honest. Just my own view. I mean, there's also possibilities of flying some aircraft from Poland, but I think Russian forces are probably going to respond to that and try to lock down the western part of Ukraine in terms of airspace. There's a lot we haven't seen them do yet that they could.
Richard, can I ask one question that's related to that? I'm curious what both Jeff and Mike would say. I mean, one of the scenarios, and I think maybe we talked about this in the last session too, was like how this could spill over. Right. And if we do see kind of a steady supply line coming in from places like Poland, Mike and Jeff, like, do you think that that Putin that he would be willing to kind of strike those supply lines and potentially strike into NATO member country like Poland?
I don't know that he would intentionally strike into Poland. I think insofar as he would be willing to use the Air Force in Western Ukraine to strike those things, I think he'd feel free to strike them.
Jeff, you're breaking up. So let's go. Jeff, let's go back to you when you have a connection restored. Mike, what's your take on this?
They've already threatened to interdict any supplies coming into Ukraine. It's going to be challenging for them to do because their best way of doing that will probably be by aircraft and helicopters, unless they want to try to create a whole separate axis of advance. They haven't done that yet. There's a lot of danger to them trying to interdict it because of man-portable air defense systems. So they're going to have challenges just trying to interdict it with limited use of air assets. I don't see them striking into Poland or anything like that, because the last thing they would want to do, right, is to actually give NATO the rationale and the motivation to create some kind of no-fly zone to have a greater intervention. I don't think they're going to do that.
Jeff, you're back. We lost you a few words into.
Oh, sorry about that.
But go ahead.
No, I apparently missed. I think Mike covered. I was just saying I do think he would feel that he would be justified in striking him in Western Ukraine. I don't think he's going to intentionally go into Poland, but obviously the more action happens closer to Poland, the more you have the risk of unintended escalation.
There's another question from Johannes. Can we provide an incentive and publicly appeal to Russian and potentially Belarusian soldiers to desert if we offer them asylum in Western Europe? As far as I know, yesterday's EU directive didn't include refugees from third countries in the temporary residency. So are there incentives that could be provided to increase the desertion rates that we've seen? Mike?
I'm not sure how you're going to physically provide that incentive to them. Like, what is the means of communication you intend to use for these soldiers to give them these incentives? They're not reading Twitter. So just to be frank, it potentially yes, but right now I think that the main incentive for Russian soldiers not to fight is the fact that how poorly the effort is organized and that they were clearly lied to when they sent to the border. They believed they were going on training, and then they were pushed to the border and told nothing was going to happen, and then they were pushed across the border and told they would be greeted as liberators. And the craziest thing about the initial operation is they really were driving around Ukraine like they were in their own country. If you actually look at Russian forces in the first couple of days, they were driving into Ukraine as though they didn't expect any opposition. And sure enough, this whole effort began rapidly collapsing as they faced resistance. And I think many of them now, well, for the first couple of days, frankly, didn't know what to do. That's why you saw so much equipment being abandoned and pockets of desertions here and there. But is there incentives we create? I don't know how you communicate that. to Russian soldiers, to be perfectly honest. I think that's frankly fading on the Ukrainians. I think Ukrainians actually have done a great job of managing the information environment and posting videos that they treat POWs really well. I've seen a lot of POW videos, and it's very clear that Ukrainians treat Russian POWs really well. And that's going to be the best incentive you're going to see for soldiers to surrender.
There's a question from Jay about the movement of Kazakh armed forces equipment by rail. Any indications of potential CSTO involvement in Ukraine? Jeff, you have anything on that? And you might say a word on the latest on Belarusian participation, which seems to be in and out every day, depending on what the latest pronouncement is from Lukashenko and company.
I would be very surprised if Kazakhstan or another CSTO organization got heavily involved in this, especially after seeing the reaction from, I mean, it's a careful line that they have to walk. I would just be surprised by that. I think the Belarusians are already complicit in this. I mean, I know there were some, I don't know how confirmed they were. There were some reports of Belarusian helicopters being shot down in northwestern Ukraine, north of Kyiv, in early days. But I think, like I said, I think Lukashenko gave up sovereignty for some kind of security for himself. And so I think that if the Russians want the Belarusians to, take a larger role, they probably will.
Andrea, there's a question from Mika about whether Russia is preparing for martial law, any indicators. So I don't know if you've seen anything on that or have a thought.
So I haven't seen anything confirmed other than that was definitely a predominant message narrative going around on Twitter. And I had heard, from people inside Russia that seemed to be a rumor that was percolating around Russia too. I mean, we have seen, so I'm unsure if that is actually in the cards and whether or not that's going to be imposed shortly. But I guess the broader point is that we are already seeing the authorities significantly step up repression inside Russia in response to this. So, there were announcements about taking Echo Moskvy, one of the oldest independent Russian radio channels, off the air. There's the Duma legislation that's been introduced that would give jail times up to 15 years for people who are reporting information that's not from quote unquote official sources. So i.e. anything that the Russians don't really want you talking about. So I think, the broader point is that we are seeing, and it's already had been happening too, right? For the year leading up to this crisis, Russia had already started cracking down. The Putin regime had started cracking down on Russian civil society, journalists, all sorts of things in a way that, appears different than it had been in the past. And so this, again, we talked about what Putin is likely to do if he feels that his status is threatened. This is exactly what we're talking about. And it seems to me that this is going to continue and we're moving in a really dark direction inside Russia in a way that's also really sad for all of the Russians there who don't support the war. I mean, Richard, you talked about how much has happened in 1 week. And I don't know if we in this discussion yet have really reflected on that, but Russia also is not the country it was a week ago. And I think all of us in the Russia expert community are really grappling with that, trying to understand what that means. I mean, it feels like we are moving in the direction of looking at Russia like an Iran or something like that, where it's a highly closed, repressive regime that no longer has the capabilities that it had in the past. I think our heads are all spinning trying to understand what happens, but this repression piece is one of them. Because for a long time there had been, Putin has always been an authoritarian regime, but there had been freedoms online and other things. Russia wasn't Iran, it wasn't North Korea, it wasn't Turkmenistan, and we are kind of very rapidly moving in that direction, and it is just astonishing and really sad to see.
There's a question from Christoph. Maybe Andrea, you may have a perspective on this. How do you assess the prospects for war crimes and investigations now that the International Criminal Court has become involved? I don't know if you, Andrea, or Jeff or Mike have any thought on that.
I probably don't. But again, it kind of it goes, the ICC and highly personalist dictators. Again, if you're expecting that you're going to be tried for war crimes, these leaders, what we see time and time again is that, dig in the heels, double down, and you better be sure that you can maintain power, because if you don't, this is the future that awaits you. So it just, to me, I mean, it's necessary to do. I understand, again, why it's being done. But when we think about the effect that it has on the incentives and the motivations for Putin and the regime, it is making it ever more important for them to use all means necessary to maintain power, because otherwise, you'll be drug off to the ICC and again, jailed, killed, imprisoned is the fates that they're thinking about. And so that is creating a lot of risks and should really inform our expectations for what the Putin regime might be capable of in order to maintain power.
Let's talk for a minute about off-ramps and potential end states. I mean, Mike, you were talking about the wrong assumptions that went into this, that Ukrainians would sort of treat Russian troops as liberators. Those are my words, not yours. But also that a quick strike and sending the government fleeing was sort of the skeleton's key that was going to unlock this, and that there could be some sort of new political dispensation absent a long-term occupation. I guess the first question is, I mean, do you sense any learning over the past week with respect to these political objectives? Because if it is obvious to many that this is going to be pretty hard to meet given the military operations that have been conducted thus far, you either change the military operations, you change your political objectives. They're changing the military operations, but do you see any sense that Putin or the Russians more generally are learning in terms of their political objectives? I mean, do you think they'll be something less than what they intended a week ago?
No, I don't see a change in the political objectives. I really don't. I think that they're following through with us, and it's the military operation that I see changing on the ground. I think that they're probably rationalizing to themselves that there's far more nationalist resistance than they may have expected. Or alternatively, I also hear inklings that Putin's really furious and maybe blames the military operation itself, which a lot of political leaders often blame the military because their own assumptions about how they were trying to use force were completely wild or unfeasible. So it's one or the other, but I don't see the political aims changing in this conflict from a Russian point of view. They're not. I mean, you can hear from when you listen to Putin talk that he has not changed any of the core objectives or his approach to Ukraine.
So where does that take us in the next few weeks, do you think, if the political objectives remain the same, but are, in your analysis, unattainable given the military operations? What gives here?
What Texas says that he wanted to achieve this cheaply and without a lot of effort or bloodshed and costs. Now that all that's impossible, I think he's going to try to achieve this in a very ugly and bloody fashion. And there's going to be much more brutal fighting, and they're really going to open up the spigot on the firepower they use, and we're going to see parts of entire cities leveled. That's how it's going to play out. And believe me, this is the person who will see it through. This is the person who saw through the Second Chechen War. He saw through the Russian campaign in Syria. He will see it through. Anybody who remotely thinks he's not capable of leveling half of Kiev, I will tell you, he is. So look at what's happening to Kharkiv already.
Yeah. And Grozny and Aleppo and.
Yeah, look at Kharkiv. Look at what's happening there in Mariupol. Like I'm already seeing the sort of the turn. As I argued a couple days into this war, saying I think Russian forces are going to revert to the mean pretty quick after a couple of days, and we're starting to see evidence of that.
Jeff, let me go to you. So let's say Mike is correct, and I think you largely agree with that prognosis. It's still not clear that achieves your political objective.
No, I don't. I agree with. I don't think he can. I mean, this is super speculative, right? But if I'm looking out to how this thing ends, it's going to culminate in something, a combination of economic ruin in Moscow, unable to achieve your political objectives in Ukraine. That's going to at some point come to a head, and there's going to be some kind of release of pressure in some way, shape, or form, whether that's an escalation with NATO or Putin goes. If I had to guess, I think it's going to come to one of those things. I don't see this getting into some kind of what do you call like a stale conflict that just kind of goes on and on with the Russians indefinitely occupying parts of Kyiv and propping up a government. I don't think that they can do that. I don't think the Russian economy can survive this. And so I think we're heading towards some kind of culminating point. Whether that's in, you know, a couple months or the better part of a year is unclear. But I personally think that's the way this thing, quote unquote, resolves itself.
What do you mean by escalation by NATO?
Well, I think at some point, if the argument would be the Russian economy is failing, I'm losing control of the state, that's warfare. You can call it economic warfare. It's just warfare. It's regime change by the West. I'm going to up the ante with the West. I'm going to actually, one way to do this, you would actually take some action that would elicit an Article 5 response intentionally. So that what you're basically saying is, look, you're going to remove these economic sanctions. You're going to stop trying to destroy my regime, or I'm just going to go to war with you with all of the trappings that comes with nuclear threats and everything else in the attempt to over-escalate and get the West to back down. Like, okay, we don't want nuclear war. Let's try to figure something out. Let's restore something to Moscow so it doesn't collapse. That would be the move. That's the one of the outcomes that has the clearest logic in my mind.
I would really hope that someone within the Russian regime would move on Putin before that happened. And obviously we don't know that. And for the reasons that I said, it seems unlikely, but that is just, it's so dark. I mean, and now I'll be curious what Jeff and Mike have to say. I mean, you know, when you have these long time conflicts where, you know, if Russia can't achieve its objectives militarily, and obviously Ukraine can't expel Russian forces from their country, then it feels like the only way short of regime change in Moscow would have to be through a negotiated settlement. And I guess I don't know. Obviously, we're far away from that because we haven't seen Putin give, and the Ukrainians are still doing well enough that they're not willing to make any concessions on Crimea or neutrality or demilitarization either. But you could imagine, I mean, you just think of these tragic conflicts that do go over an extended period of time. If we do reach some sort of stalemate on the battlefield, maybe there would be some sort of room for a negotiated settlement. Maybe that's more likely if, unfortunately, Zelensky is moved from the equation, and then you have a future leader who just in Ukraine wants to end the bloodshed and the casualties. So you're not going to get at it in a peaceful way as the negotiated settlement. It's going to be because it's been bloody and protracted and you've reached a stalemate on the battlefield. But when you look at how these kind of insurgencies are resolved, negotiated settlement is the most likely way. And again, they're miles apart currently, and it's going to take a long time to get there. But I do think a third way out is through a negotiated settlement. Someone will have to move. And maybe if there's more pressure on Putin domestically, that gets him to move a teeny tiny bit without Zelensky in Ukraine, or if the kind of civilian loss is too high, maybe the two sides inch a little bit closer in time and we can get to a negotiated settlement.
Jeff or Mike, I don't know if either of you want to come in on that. If not, Andrea, this is, some of these scenarios are getting pretty dire pretty quickly. What do you see as the role of Macron or the West or the United States in a potential off-ramp or negotiated end to this? Or do you think this is a Russian-Ukrainian move here? I mean, so far everything has come to absolutely not, as we know, in terms of and in fact, at least in retrospect, it seems like some of the diplomacy moved everyone backwards because there was a feeling of utter deception on the part of the Western Europeans who were going over to Moscow to chew over implementation of the Minsk Protocol while Putin was planning to execute a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But nevertheless, if there's going to be something short of utter destruction, then potentially there is a diplomatic outcome to be had at some point, although now it's not the point, it feels like, where that's possible. So is this a Russian-Ukrainian move bilaterally, or do you think that this is a broader diplomatic process or potential move that includes the United States or other countries?
I think it's a Russia-Ukraine thing. And, we see that they've had 2 rounds of talks now, and obviously they're not bearing fruit at this moment for all the reasons we've said. We wouldn't expect that negotiations are going to bear any fruit in the near term. But to me, I don't see a huge role for the United States and Europe. It's important that we continue. I think it is a positive thing that Macron keeps talking to Putin, that he's hearing from other voices other than from the people that are immediately surrounding him. And I think that the role of the United States and NATO and European allies and partners is just to continue kind of the resolute pressure that they've applied so far, to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons that they need to continue their resistance, to continue the resolute and punishing economic sanctions on the economy. Obviously, we're doing things like intelligence sharing. So continuing to support Ukraine on the battlefield, continuing with the harsh sanctions. There's maybe other things that we could think about doing in terms of, trying to peel oligarchs off of Putin. I think what we need to do at this point too with the sanctions, though, is to be really clear about how some of the sanctions would be lifted. To me, that's one of the things that's still really missing. And I do think that there are likely some oligarchs and others who might be willing to speak out against the war if it means that the West would unfreeze their assets. I think we need to start being creative about how we can peel some of these people away from Putin. The information piece is another really big thing. I don't know how we do it, but clearly Russians are not seeing the same picture of what's happening in Ukraine that the rest of the world is. This is still, a special operation. And so to the extent that it's possible, I think I had seen that maybe BBC is trying to beam broadcasting in 1 hour, every Sunday or whatever it is, starting to kind of get creative about how we can ensure that Russians have access to information so that they have a more realistic picture of what's actually happening. So I guess, that's not the off-ramps piece. So I think my answer is it's just about this resolute pushback against Putin, but the negotiations to me seem like they're largely a Russia-Ukraine thing at this time.
Let me close, Mike, with just a last question to you. So we talked about Russian morale among the troops, and Andrea has spoken about the ignorance of the war among average Russians, or disaffection with what's happening in their own society now. But what about on the Ukrainian side? You pay a lot of attention to this. You grew up in Kiev, I think, for a few years, and all of this. So this has a personal resonance with you. There's been a lot made of, I think quite rightly, of Zelensky's bravery and spirit. And you see, Ukrainians spending their time training to fight in a resistance. What's your kind of overall diagnosis of where the Ukrainian morale is this far into this very difficult situation?
I think the morale of people fighting in Ukraine is quite high. They've done a great job withstanding the sort of initial shock of the Russian invasion. Zelensky didn't flee. I think he's doing a really good job kind of performing as a wartime leader. He and his administration are fundamentally one of the centers of gravity in this fight. I think that you've seen, if anything, resistance increase, as some suspected it might, and the rise of partisan movements. And you've seen a lot of Ukrainians themselves protest peacefully in towns that Russian forces have occupied. And all that speaks to the kind of big evolutions that you've seen taking place in Ukraine, particularly since 2014, too. The big things that I think Russian leadership got wrong in the country. I myself am really surprised by Zelensky. I'll be frank. I was kind of a big critic of his, particularly in the run-up to this, because people like me were saying the invasion was coming, and felt like people like him really were not taking it nearly seriously enough. But I've obviously come around. So I think a lot of other people were probably critics of Zelensky as well in the run-up to this for all sorts of things, not just the invasion. But let's put it this way: I think he's a much better wartime leader of Ukraine than he was a peacetime leader of Ukraine. I'll summarize it that way. I guess that's my short view of it. And one thing I'm impressed is, although a lot of people have left, I get nothing but reach outs day to day from colleagues and friends still in Kiev who are there. They're still there holding down the fort. And they want to engage and they want to connect. In fact, that's kind of looking to the right. A number of folks that I know that are friends of mine, they're journalists and people who also work these issues. in Kiev, and they're still there. They haven't left. So that's the only I can say. That's about it.
All right. Thank you. Mike Kaufman, Jeff Edmonds, Andrea Kendall-Taylor. Thank you guys again. We may try to do another 1 or 2 or 3 of these, depending on the course of events. And we're really grateful for your time and expertise today. And we will be back in the future. And thanks to everybody who joined us today for this check-in on the course of events in Ukraine and what may be coming down the pike here next. Thanks to everybody, and have a good day.